In this multi-part video, I'm going to be talking to you about something that really fascinates me, and that is polar patterns in microphones. Afterwards, I'm going to be talking to you about something that we call beamforming in ambisonics, and finally, I'm going to show you something that I have been working on for the past year and a half, and I'm really excited to share with you for the very first time. My name is Alejandro, and we are the Audio Brewers. Consider a microphone. Every single microphone is completely different from one another, and I'm not talking about the color it applies on the sound. I'm talking about the polar pattern. The polar pattern is probably the most important thing when it comes to choosing a microphone. Some microphones are made for capturing sounds in a very directional manner, whereas some others are made for capturing sounds in a very omnidirectional manner. So, when getting a microphone, you should always have into account its polar pattern. Every single manufacturer will tell you what the polar pattern of a specific microphone is and the frequency response in that specific polar pattern. So, we're going to talk about polar patterns right now, and we're going to start with the omnidirectional polar pattern, which is the most basic polar pattern. An omnidirectional polar pattern is telling us in a nutshell that that specific microphone will grab the sound pressure changes equally regardless of where they are located around that microphone. So here I have an omnidirectional microphone, and this omnidirectional microphone will grab the level of my voice regardless of me being located in front of it, behind it, above it, below it. It doesn't matter where I will be, it will always grab the sound equally. So these microphones are very useful for certain applications. For example, when you want to calibrate your room, you want to place the microphones in the middle, and then you want to play some sound from all the speakers, and you need this microphone to grab the sound equally from each of every single speakers. They are very useful for this type of things, but they're completely non-directional, meaning that because they're grabbing the sound equally from any sound source around them, you cannot actually aim the microphone anywhere because it's always gonna grab everything with the same level. So this is the most basic polar pattern that there is. And if you look at the frequency response of any omnidirectional microphone, you will see that no matter the frequency, these microphones are always going to be grabbing the same level of sound regardless of where the sound is coming from. And this creates like a round, and this is exactly why the omnidirectional polar pattern is represented like a circle, because it grabs the sound equally from anywhere around the microphone. Now, there is something very interesting here to check out. You can see here that the omnidirectional microphone has the diaphragm in front, and this diaphragm chamber is completely sealed on the back. That is because we want to grab the sound pressure levels from in front of the diaphragm so that it is as flat as possible. However, the diaphragm has two sides. Here, the back side of the diaphragm is sealed. What happens if we uncover the back side of the diaphragm? Now, let's talk about the cardioid polar pattern. In the cardioid polar pattern, you have, again, just like in the omnidirectional microphone, the diaphragm is exposed in front. However, unlike the omnidirectional microphone, where the diaphragm is completely sealed, here you have some openings in the back of the diaphragm, and these openings are really important, and we're going to talk about them in a while. The cardioid polar pattern microphone pretty much tells us that the microphone is grabbing everything that is happening in front of the diaphragm, and at the same time is rejecting whatever sound is coming from behind the diaphragm, meaning that the microphone is going to be grabbing slowly louder the sounds as they go in the front of the microphone, and then as they go to the back of the microphone is going to be grabbed less and less until you're going to be rejecting the signal. It looks like a heart, like a upside down heart, and this is why it's called a cardioid. So if you were to look at the frequency response charts of any cardioid polar pattern, you will be seeing that these microphones are always going to be grabbing a specific frequency very clearly in front, and then as you go to the back, it's going to be canceling it, and every single polar pattern chart is going to have the same shape. I have here my cardioid microphone. You can see that it has the front of the diaphragm exposed, but you also have the back of the diaphragm exposed through these holes. These holes are called the port, and they have a specific purpose. Let's just imagine that you have a sound source emitting a 1 kilohertz sound from in front of the microphone. This sound will travel the front of the diaphragm and will hit it at a specific time. Let's just say that the time is 0, right? However, this doesn't stop here because a cardioid microphone works in 2 steps. After the sound touches the front of the diaphragm, naturally the sound continues to travel. However, because you have this port here opening, the sound will also enter the rear of the diaphragm through here. And the sound is not entering immediately because it has a distance that it has to travel. This creates a natural delay. However, the port is designed so that it introduces a further delay on the sound reaching the rear of the diaphragm. So you have two delays happening here. The natural delay that happens between the moment the sound touches the front of the diaphragm and the moment it travels to the back, and the artificial delay that the port is designed to introduce in the sound. Both of these times ensure that when the sound reaches the rear of the diaphragm, it reaches half a period later. This means that when the sound reaches the front of the diaphragm and it pushes the diaphragm, the sound will also travel to the back of the diaphragm and is gonna pull the diaphragm. So it pushes from above and it pulls from below, meaning there is a reinforcement in the sound. And this is why when the sound comes from in front, you have a perfect, clear recording of the sound. So what happens when the sound comes from the rear of the microphone? Well, the story is really interesting. Let's just consider that you have the same sound, but this time is coming from the rear of the microphone, right? So the sound travels to the diaphragm, but before it reaches the front of the diaphragm, it's hitting the port, right? So the sound enters the port and then continues to travel to the front of the diaphragm. We have said that the distance between the port and the front of the diaphragm is a natural delay, and that the port introduces an artificial delay to this signal. So both of these delays ensure that the sound hits the diaphragm at the same time, right? So the moment the sound actually reaches the rear of the diaphragm is exactly the same moment where the sound reaches the front of the diaphragm due to the natural delay. This means that when the sound pushes the diaphragm from behind, it's also pushing the diaphragm from in front, and when you have pushing on one side and pushing on the other, you're actually not moving the diaphragm at all. They're cancelling out, so they're nulling the signal, thus not creating any sound. And this is why when the sound comes from the rear, the diaphragm is not registering any sound, whereas when it comes from in front, it does. An amazing design marvel, right? Now, what will happen if I were to expose the back of this diaphragm even more? Let's just imagine that you have the diaphragm completely free. Well, this will create our third and most common polar pattern, which is the figure of 8 pattern, which is the diaphragm being exposed completely, meaning that it will grab the sound from the front and from the back equally, however, with a different polarity, because when the sound is coming from the front, you have the positive polarity, and when the sound is coming from the back, you have the negative polarity. And this figure of 8 microphone is going to reject whatever is sounding on the side of the microphone. It's just going to be grabbing what is in front and what is at the back with natural positive and negative polarities. Now, if you were to look at the frequency response chart of one of these figure of 8 microphones, you will see that there is a blob in front of the microphone and then another blob behind the microphone, creating the number 8. And this is why they're called figure of 8, because they reject whatever is happening in the sides of the microphone, and you are only grabbing whatever is in front with a positive polarity or whatever comes from behind with a negative polarity. These microphones are really, really cool, especially if you're using like ribbon microphones, which is a completely different subject, but they really, really have nice sound. So these were the most basic polar patterns that there are, but these are the polar patterns when you have one diaphragm in the microphone. There are microphones that offer multiple polar patterns, and to be able to do that, they use multiple diaphragms, and they really are interesting because they work differently than these types of microphone. Let's talk about them. And here we have a microphone that can offer you multiple polar patterns. How does it work? Well, in theory, it's very simple. If you look at the microphone from the side, you will see that it contains two diaphragms, and each of these diaphragms is working independently, but then is being summed inside of the microphone. These two diaphragms are just two cardioid diaphragms, like the ones that we talked about before. So imagine that you place two cardioid diaphragms looking at the opposite side of one another. One cardioid diaphragm will be grabbing one side and the other will be grabbing the other side. In a nutshell, this is how this microphone works. Let's just explore it further. So I'm going to place the microphone like this for the sake of this example. You have the front of the microphone here and you have behind the microphone here. So when you select the omnidirectional polar pattern through the buttons, all you're doing is simply enabling both the cardioid diaphragms and summing them together with the same polarity. So it will be the same that just grabbing these two microphones and just placing them like this, so that this grabs in front and this grabs in front, and then you just sum everything and you get your omnidirectional signal. When you move to the cardioid polar pattern, and this is interesting here, you are enabling the polar pattern that is in front, and one could say that you are completely disabling the one in the back. However, you are not completely disabling it. I will say that it's enabled just a little bit with an opposite polarity, so that you can reject even further whatever is happening in the back of this microphone. And then there is the figure of 8 polar pattern. When you go to the figure of 8, all you're doing is simply enabling the cardioid polar pattern in the front and the cardioid polar pattern in the back, but then you have here the phase is inverted, meaning that when the two cardioids are joining, they're canceling each other, so the blob of the cardioid becomes smaller, and then you're grabbing a blob from in front and a blob from behind. And this is your figure of 8 here. It's different than the figure of 8 of a natural ribbon microphone. It's a composite figure of 8 because it's using two cardioid diaphragms. This is really, really cool. But then there is the in-between. What happens when you start messing with how loud the inverted cardioid is on the back? So we say that in a cardioid polar pattern, you have just a little bit so that it rejects perfectly the behind, and then you have in front. And in a figure of 8, you have the same level in the back and in the front, so you have a much smaller blob in which of the sides, but then you have the sound traveling to both sides. As you start diminishing the level of the rear inverted cardioid diaphragm, the top cardioid diaphragm is going to be increasing in size, thus becoming less directional, but the rejection is going to be greater because this is becoming smaller and this is becoming bigger. And this is how you create in-between polar patterns such as hypercardioid or supercardioid, which are polar patterns where you have more directionality, but then you sacrifice something that I like calling the bleed, which is a little bit of sound is coming from behind just so that you can have more directionality in front. These microphones are really, really useful when you want to really get sound from a specific direction, but then you're sacrificing the fact that it's also grabbing a little bit of sound from behind. But then, yes, you have the in-betweens, which is the polar patterns that are happening between the cardioid and the figure of 8. And finally, we have the shotgun polar pattern, which is not a polar pattern per se, because it depends a lot on the design of the microphone. First, you have the diaphragm located inside the microphone, but then you see that the microphone is very long and it's got a lot of small holes in the side. These holes are designed to reject the sound that is coming from the side and from behind, so that you can capture the sound that is coming from in front as clear as possible. These microphones are extremely directional, meaning that if you point at the sound source, you're gonna grab it clearly, but as soon as the sound source gets off axis, you're gonna stop grabbing it in theory. So they're very difficult to work with, but they're very useful when you're doing something like capturing dialogue and when you're shooting a film or something. And the problem with this microphone is that you need a good microphone operator with the microphone because they have to be always focusing at the sound source. So we have been talking about polar patterns for a while, and here comes the question that I had from the very beginning of the video. I'm not sure if you noticed, whenever we were looking at the frequency response charts of each of these microphones, they were only taking into account like 25 to 30 decibels. And this is very interesting because, you know, we're in the digital era, and 25, 30 decibels, it can be a lot in the analog world, but it's not much in the digital world. Why is only 25 to 30 decibel taken into account? How would it be different if we were with digital audio in mind? And why am I posing this question? Well, we're gonna talk about it in our next video. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Alejandro. I hope you learned a lot. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let them below in the comment section. See you on the next one. Cheers.